Hello everybody and welcome to Capture the Magic of Winter. My name is Danielle and I am a photographer from Regina on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Together with the City of Regina and Project Play, we have created a free beginner photography class. Capture the Magic of Winter is an outdoor photo exploration and exhibition. After you've hopefully learned some new skills today, you can head outside and photograph your favorite outdoor space. If you don't know where to go, I'll have a list of recommendations of places to explore at the end of this video. On January 17th at 7:30 p.m., you can join me on Zoom for a live Q&A with Whitney Blaisdell, the director of Project Play. Up until February 1st, you can submit up to 5 of your favorite winter images for the community exhibition. This exhibition will be rotating through different public spaces, outdoor public spaces, up until March 1st, as well as displayed in a virtual exhibition on the Project Play website. In this video, I'm going to give you the basics of digital SLR photography, smartphone photography, and some tips on how to take a more engaging photo. So let's get to it. Starting with your digital camera, let's talk about the main components of it. We've got our lens, we've got the camera body, and what we're going to be using on here is our shutter button, the dials to change our settings, the viewfinder, which is what we're going to look through to take a picture, and we'll also explore a couple of these modes. Making sure that your lens is set to autofocus, let's turn your camera on and make sure that your camera is recording the highest resolution JPEG possible. These are manageable file sizes for your camera to record, as well as storing on your computer and sharing with us. So looking through your viewfinder, you might notice that there are some squares or dots. These are your focal points and they represent what you're going to be focusing on. You can select a focal point if your subject is somewhere off center in your photo, and that is what your camera will focus on. By pressing your shutter button halfway down with your camera lens on autofocus, your camera will focus on your subject, and when you compress it all the way down, then it'll take your picture. All right, so what is photography? Well, it's how we document what we see. And digital cameras do this by recording light through a sensor. We need light to make a photograph, and I'm going to tell you how you can use it by controlling your exposure. Your exposure is composed of 3 different things: your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. These 3 things make up something called the exposure triangle, and one will always impact the other, so it's important to have a good understanding of how they work. Your exposure meter in your camera is a good point of reference to see if your photo is going to be exposed properly. You can usually find this when looking through your viewfinder. If the mark is in the middle, that usually indicates that your photo is properly exposed. Anything on the negative side is considered underexposed, and anything on the positive side would be considered overexposed. Firstly, let's talk about aperture. An aperture is the size of the hole in your lens that allows light into your camera. These are controlled by something called your f-stop numbers, which stand for focal length. If you have a smaller f-stop number, you're going to be letting more light into your camera. And if you have a bigger f-stop number, you're going to be letting less light into your camera. So smaller number, more light; larger number, less light. Not only does aperture control how much light gets let into your camera, but it also controls something called your depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of foreground or background that remains in focus. It's the distance around your subject that remains sharp. So if you have a wider aperture or a smaller number, that means your subject will be sharp and anything in the foreground or background will be out of focus, and you'll have less detail in the background and foreground. If you have a narrower aperture or a bigger number, you're going to have a deeper range of focus, which is ideal for landscapes when you want everything in the picture to be in focus. Next up in the exposure triangle is shutter speed. And shutter speed is the amount of time that your camera's curtains are open to allow light in. If you have a fast shutter speed, you're going to be letting less light in, whereas if you have a slower shutter speed, you're going to allow the camera to let more light in. Shutter speed also allows you to choose how you want to show motion. So if you have a fast shutter speed, you're going to freeze motion, and if you have a slower shutter speed, you're going to blur motion. I recommend that if you are going to be playing around with slower shutter speeds, to set your camera up on a tripod, just so you can avoid an overall blurry photo. Last step in the exposure triangle is ISO, and ISO is the sensor's sensitivity to light. So if you have a lower ISO number, your camera sensor is going to be less sensitive to light, whereas if you have a higher ISO number, your camera is going to be more sensitive to light, making your image much brighter. But not only does ISO give you more brightness in your image, it can also increase the noise or the grain in your image. So that just means you're going to have a lower quality image the higher you go with your ISO. I would recommend using a lower ISO for when you're shooting outside in the daylight. And if it's not possible for you to change your aperture or shutter speed to get the photo that you want, and you just need a little bit more light, you can increase your ISO in small increments till you're happy with the shot that you've got. Remember that adjusting any part of the exposure triangle will impact the other. So look at the back of your camera and play around with your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO until you get something that you're happy with. If you just want to explore aperture or shutter speed by themselves, you can do so with these modes on your camera. The first one being aperture priority mode. Depending on what your camera brand is, it might be called a V or A mode. And in this mode, you'll be able to select the aperture that you want, and based on your selection, the camera will select the best shutter speed. There's also shutter priority mode, and again, depending on your camera's brand, it might be called TV or S mode. And here you'll be able to select your shutter speed, and based on your selection, the camera will select the best aperture to give you a properly exposed photo. I would recommend, if you are going to be playing around with these modes, to set your camera up on a tripod, just because you might have to play around with a slower shutter speed, which will give you a blurry photo if you're not still. The last thing I want to talk about on your digital SLR is your white balance. Typically you want the colors to be the same as how your eyes see them, and your camera won't always record them that way. So you can use the preset functions on your camera to select the white balance depending on what kind of light you're working with. So if it's a cloudy day, if you're in full shade, if it's full sun, selecting one of these depending on what your surroundings are currently like will just alter the tones a little bit and just make them more true to color. All right, so let's move on to smartphones. Always make sure that your battery is fully charged before you head out, because phones tend to lose battery power quicker once they get outside into cooler temperatures. Another thing I like to make sure that I always do before I take any picture is make sure that my camera lens is clean. Just from handling it a lot and being in my pocket, it gets so many fingerprints and dust. So always just give it a wipe with a lens wipe or whatever you have on you that won't scratch your lens. And that'll just give you a much clearer photo. Sometimes our smartphone cameras think that the subject is always in the center, but that's not the case sometimes. So if you hold down your subject on your camera, it'll lock focus onto your subject, and then you can adjust the brightness or exposure on your subject before you even take the picture. Now that you have a better understanding of how to use your camera, let's talk about how to make a more engaging photo. Taking a picture is the best part, and some of my favorite ways to creatively shoot is by utilizing negative space, finding patterns and symmetry, and framing my subject with a natural frame. One thing that will eventually just come second nature is the rule of thirds, and the rule of thirds is a guideline for a well-balanced image. If you divide your photo up into 9 equal parts, your subject should fall along an intersecting line for just a more visually appealing photo. Remember those grid lines on your phone? You can use those as a reference for the rule of thirds. A few other tips that I wanted to share with you are how to take a better portrait. So when you're taking a portrait of somebody, always make sure that you're focusing on the eyes, because that is the first place that people tend to look when they look at a picture of somebody. If you're taking a picture of somebody further back, using your focal point on any part of their face would be ideal, just to make sure that the eyes or face are in focus and the sharpest part of the picture. If you're photographing an outdoor winter activity like tobogganing or ice skating, play around with your shutter speed to show motion. So again, if you want to freeze motion, you're going to want to use a faster shutter speed. And if you want to blur motion, you're going to want to use a slower shutter speed. Lastly, if you're taking a landscape photo, make sure that you have a larger number so that more of your image will be in focus, meaning you have a greater depth of field. The last thing I want to talk about on making a more engaging photo is changing your perspective. Something I'm always thinking about is, can I eliminate a distracting element by moving in closer to my subject? Always moving around your subject, because maybe you'll find something that you're happier with in the end. If you're looking to polish up your photos after you've taken them, there are a lot of different free apps and software available for you. The Regina Public Library also has a digital media studio that is free with your library card. So you can also play around with that if that's something that you're interested in. If you're feeling stuck on what to shoot, my suggestion would be coming up with a theme for yourself. So whether that be footprints or pathways, portraits, winter activities, landscapes, come up with a theme and then you have an idea of what you're looking for. If you don't know where to go, a couple of my favorite places to explore in the city are the Habitat Conservation, Wascana Center, A.E. Wilson Park. Remember that when you're going out to do this activity to make sure you're following all Sask Health Authority guidelines, including physical distancing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something and I cannot wait to see how you capture the magic of winter. Don't forget to join us on January 17th at 7:30 p.m. for a live Q&A. And until then, get outside, have fun, stay safe, stay warm. Thank you so much.